Well, thank you for the invite to talk. What I wanted to do with this, and what I think I was supposed to do with this, was to do something a bit more sort of what's going on, bigger picture stuff, and then get that towards what you might do at local level, or how you might think about some of these things at a local level. The old slogan, you know, I think applies now more than ever. I did want to start with this, with these two people, who I'm sure you recognise. Yes, one of them is the finance minister of a heavily indebted European country where tax evasion and corruption have suffered years of austerity. And the other, of course, is Yanis Varoufakis, who's the Greek finance minister. Look, I make no bones about this, but it's been a fantastic couple of weeks for anyone who's had any sense. And basically, I've lived my entire adult life, and then some, like this, where all you've ever been told is that a whole list of things that seem perfectly plausible, in fact not plausible and reasonable, and that in the immortal words of Margaret Thatcher, there really is no alternative. And that what I think we've seen over the last few weeks, particularly with the election of a Syriza-led government in Greece, and by the way, this is a government that in its first 3 days announces a doubling of the minimum wage, an increase of pensions back to their pre-crisis level, clamp down on naturalisation of all children of migrants living in Greece, and symbolically, of course, tearing down the barriers that otherwise surrounded the Parliament building in Athens for the last 5 years or so. So there is kind of an alternative here. Now, recent news is maybe that's a harder fight than you'd want it to be, but nonetheless, the sky hasn't fallen in. And I think if you start from thinking, well, actually, it is possible to do something different, and it doesn't matter whether it's on a grand national scale or whether it's a local scale, it is possible to do something different, and that, I think, is what I took, at least, from the election. But I wanted to start from, and spend some time on, where we are now, and what we might do about it, how we might get out of this. This is, purportedly, it's meant to be Manchester in about the 1850s. I slightly suspect it's not actually Manchester, but, you know, the internet never lies, as everybody knows. And I start with this, Manchester in the 1870s, because one element of the crisis, until fairly recently, and I'll come on to fairly recently, one element that I think has had the most immediate impact on people, the bit where they start to think there is something up, is what's happened to, and this is a crude measure of like things not working well, but what's happened to average wages over the amount of people paid over the last few years. What you're looking at here is, if you can see it at the top, does that work? Not quite. If you can see at the top, there's average real wage growth from 1860 through to 2014. So it's the amount that people's pay is rising every year, the average pay, every year, from 1860, so that's as far back as official records go, right the way through to 2014. Basically, you can see that what you get is kind of growth. On the whole, this is virtually the entire existence of industrial capitalism in this country. On the whole, you get an increase in how much people are paid. On the whole, you could say, well, whatever else we might say about it, people seem to be getting better off. That's what this means. You've got growing, rising real wages over time, with the exception, fairly obviously, of some major recessions. The 30s, not quite so bad in this country. The 20s, particularly bad, more so than the Great Depression here on average. Another one in the early 1900s, a few heading into 70s and 80s, you can see. And then, of course, you get to what's happened since about 2007, 2008. Right? Now, this is completely unprecedented. This has never happened before. There isn't any comparable period in modern British history where you have continual, year after year after year, declines in the amount that most people are getting paid. And at least since about 2013, this has been happening at the same time as our usual measure of economic progress, gross domestic product, GDP, is going up and up. So it's a complete breakdown at that point of what is supposed to happen. There's something very, very unusual, very particular that's taking place here. Now, what you'll have noticed, perhaps over the last few months or so, is that this enormous drop here in average pay has started to pick up a bit. That because the price of oil has fallen, has fallen so much in the last 6 months or so, you know, more than halved since about June last year, it's pulled down the price of everything else. As a result of this, even the very small money wage increases people are getting are above just the kind of average rate of price increase, the rate of inflation. So as a result of this, people are getting ever so slightly, the average is getting ever so slightly better off. Now, of course, the issue within that is the average only tells you, well, it tells you the average. It doesn't tell you the distribution. It doesn't tell you what's going on at the top. And it doesn't particularly tell you what's going on at the bottom. It takes a kind of summary of what's going on here. What we might suspect, and what Thomas Piketty's very good book, released last year, Capital in the 21st Century, makes very clear, is that there's been an enormous increase in inequality over the last 30 years or so. That you've had a process where those who have wealth have simply been able to take more and more of it, and more people have been excluded from that. And you have an incredible rise in inequality, certainly in the UK. If you take the UK, this country's seen about the fastest rise in inequality of any developed country in the last 30 years or so. There is a problem, of course, to get back to oil, with saying, oh well, if the price of oil has gone down, that has made people's wages go up. The problem you run into fairly critically, and I suppose I don't spend too much time in it with this audience, is that you can't just carry on burning oil forevermore. This is from Stockholm Institute, if memory serves, an attempt to represent planetary boundaries. The idea that in a number of different respects, the various kind of ecosystems, the various sort of natural world features that we rely on, that the economy actually sits in, themselves have limits. And that if you carry on using up resources at the pace we are doing, you very rapidly cross over these limits with all sorts of actually fairly unknown consequences. We don't know. You know, at the minute, the current prediction is that there's a sort of 1%, 1.5% chance of temperature increases hitting 6 degrees by the end of this century. We have absolutely no way of knowing what that will entail for how we live our lives. The whole of human history doesn't live in a world that is that warm. We don't have any experience of this. But we can strongly suspect it won't necessarily be very pleasant. So if you have an economic system, and we do have one, that is starting to not produce the goods for most people, that's what it means if average wages are not rising. And if the only way it starts to look like it's getting somewhere is by having this plummet in the price of oil, which of course eats in massively into things that will cost us very, very dearly at some point in the future, this is starting to look particularly unpleasant. The other feature of that, of course, is this is also a system that's increasingly reliant on the production of debt. Now, I've mentioned already that Britain's heavily indebted. This is not, for this country, it is for Greece, but it's not for this country, a question of the government debt. That if you look at the pattern of borrowing in Britain, that if you look, again, it's the last 30 years, this period of neoliberalism that's critical here. If you look over the last 30 years, you get a pattern of borrowing in which instead of the economy growing faster and then people borrow a bit and it keeps up with the growth of the economy, we get debt growing much faster than the economy. So it's debt that pulls the economy along rather than the economy that pulls the debt along. And that's critical, because the important thing about debt, this is how it works, is that you always have to pay it back. Now, if average real incomes are declining and everybody's sitting on piles of debt, and at present they're starting to add to those piles of debt, we're getting a boom despite falling real incomes because people are going out and borrowing again and spending. That's what's happened over the last 18 months or so. The debt has to be repaid, and it has to be repaid with interest. If you want to repay a debt with interest in the future, you have to have more money in the future. If your money's falling, you can't repay the debt with interest. This is queuing everything up for a crisis, and sticking my economist hat on, I'll be astonished if we get through the next few years without running into another crisis of one form or another, perhaps fairly soon. Where does that get you if you have a crisis? Well, this is, people remember the date, and you might be able to see, maybe not recognise, but see the building, Lehman Brothers, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, the collapse, essentially of the world financial system, or at least its key elements in America and Britain and then Europe, on the 15th of September 2008, precisely as a result of this failure of debt and a failure to repay debt that then cascades throughout the entire system, drags the whole lot down. This is kind of what a crisis of a very, very major scale looks like. And of course you get a response to it, which is, here is student protests back in 2010 against the rise in tuition fees at Conservative Party headquarters. You get a response to it of austerity imposed here on a grand scale. Not quite as grand as it is in Greece or Southern Europe, but the scale of cuts here is essentially the greatest for a good few generations since the 1930s. The scale of the planned cuts, the restrictions on government expenditure to come to deal with this apparent problem of government debt is, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, whose Green Book, very reputable assessment of government finances, was out just a couple of days ago, will take us back to a level of expenditure last seen in the 1930s. and that is by 2019. So it's the next 4 years or so we'll get there if we carry on in this line of march. Austerity hasn't worked. It's been applied all over the place. It's been applied very dramatically in southern Europe and right the way across Europe in general. It's been applied less dramatically but still substantially here. It hasn't worked because McKinsey finally brought out their report on what's happened to global debt since the crisis. We are supposed to have been, having gone through one debt crisis, the collapse of the financial system and everything that entailed, we're supposed to be going through a period of what they like to call, economists like to call, deleveraging. Everyone's getting rid of their debt. You're paying down debt. If you think about what's happened in this country, that did actually happen for ordinary people. I think a lot of people hit 2008 and started trying to pay off their debts. Now, that has a downside problem because if they're paying debt over here, spending over there. If they're not spending, other people aren't earning money, you just drive everything into recession. Basically, that's what happens. If the government then also turns up and says, we're not going to spend, that drags the whole thing down as well. But this $57 trillion is the amount of new debt that's been added to the world's total pile of debt since 2008. It's a massive, massive increase. Not so much in what used to get called the developed world, but appearing in particular in sort of middle-income countries and the developing world. China really leading the way in particular on this. Incredible expansion of debt. And that is what's starting to pull apparent growth along. But none of this really makes much sense. That you have an economic system that only functions at all if you can create loads and loads of debt, and that kind of just about drags everything along behind it. Can't produce improvements in real incomes. You know, what's happening in Britain is a common pattern across the developed world. In the US, very strikingly. In Europe, a bit more balanced. But this decline in most people's standards of living is something that's actually quite generalised, and the compensation for it is you create loads of debt. I just wanted to illustrate this thing about government debt not being the entirety of the problem in this country. And that austerity is, to be polite, a somewhat ill-conceived response to the kind of trouble that we've got ourselves into. This shows the debt of each of the four big different parts of the whole economy. So you've got government in blue, you've got households, that's you and I, in red, you've got non-financial corporations, so businesses that actually produce stuff, and then you've got financial corporations in purple, shown as a share of GDP. GDP, national income, how much is the whole economy producing every year? Basically, that's capacity to repay this debt. That's capacity to repay this debt. What you see from 1987 right the way through to here is, okay, yes, government debt has risen somewhat, right? This is what's happened since 2007, 2008. This is what we're chasing with austerity. The real problem, I would put it to you, is perhaps what's going on in this purple monster over here, which is a pretty conservative estimate for the total debt of the financial system. That if you want to start to address an underlying economic problem in this country, fixating on this, rather than doing anything about this, is entirely the wrong way to go about things. And bear in mind that this you can expand. I mean, bigger estimates of this get you up to about 1,000% of GDP quite easily. You know, if you start to include more complicated things like derivatives and all the other sort of financial doohickeys. So what do we do about it? I don't know if anybody this is apparently Cornwall. I mean, I'm relying a lot on you know, see, it looks about right. So it's Cornwall. So what do you do about it, and how does any of this come in here? Well, look, we're launching, I'll say a little bit about this and wrap up. We're launching at NEF a programme of work over the next 3 years or so that we're calling the Blue New Deal. The aim here is to get into what it is specifically about coastal communities right the way around the country, that they can do something that they've not necessarily been able or had the capacity to do, or it just hasn't happened for one reason or another, which is start to manage themselves a bit better by taking care of the natural environment, by taking care of their people, their communities, breaking with what I've called that neoliberal model that otherwise gets forced on them, and try and do something different. But these are the main sort of problems that you find in coastal communities in general, right the way around the country. Higher than average unemployment, dependency in single industries, most often tourism, and public sector jobs, which shouldn't really be a problem, but if you've got a government which is currently saying that it's going to carry on massively cutting, and any future government is going to carry on massively cutting public sector spending. I mean, look, the projections for this is that you get 700,000 job losses in the public sector over the next 4 years or so on the rate of cuts that the government is talking about. So that's a problem, yes? Because that means you're losing jobs there if that's the case. So what do you do about it? Well, what do you do about it, I think you've all kind of talked about one way or the other in the rest of these sessions. I think the key elements to this is that, this is rather sort of high level, which means lacking in detail, to be less polite. But you want to have an aim locally where you're saying you're not just creating any old jobs, you're creating good jobs, that you build into how you're thinking, not just is it a job of any sort whatsoever. I mean, God, we've got an economy that does produce jobs of any sort whatsoever. Look at the expansion over the last few years of zero-hour contracts, self-employment of a very ropey kind, all sorts of things. Good jobs. Jobs that are well paid and secure at a minimum. How do you manage natural assets, which I think is key for any coastal area, or certainly any rural area at all? Now, there's immense resource here that is poorly served by a kind of neoliberal, privatised, all the rest of it approach. How can we take these things, which are a resource that the community as a whole can look after? How can we develop new ownership models? How can we manage things properly? I mean, the one that's striking, and this one that NEF has done a lot of work on, is fishing in particular. And the way in which overfishing, this immense natural resource, has been completely battered by a set of very obvious systemic failures. And how do you diversify economies as part of that? How do you get away from dependencies on just single industries in places? All of this requires, I think, a different approach. It requires an approach where you engage people in discussion about what kind of economy you want. You try and think plausibly about what levers you might want to get hold of, about what resources you can draw on locally, and you start to try and plan and think outside the box, which otherwise says, take any job there is, be grateful for what turns up, and that's your lot. I think we need a bit more ambition in this. What I'd also like to suggest is that people are doing work locally. NEF would love to hear about it, because I think one of the things we can usefully do is spread the good news on that one, which is start to say, look, if it's working here, it can work somewhere else. And you can start to see how all these different little bits and pieces add up into a real systemic change overall. So, that's a lot. I think that's 25 minutes. Thank you very much for the invite. I think there might be time for questions.
Well, to be honest, I know you're an economist, but I could listen to you all day. We've got a couple of minutes. That's an awful lot in there, and it resonated perfectly with the issues that came up this morning. Have we got a couple of questions that we might have, or thought we might, for James? Okay, over here we've got an economics student who isn't 24, actually, my mistake.
Yeah, I wish I was, but I was just wondering, because I've listened to some arguments today from some of the councillors that are here as well about the problems they face with trying to implement ideas. Do you think that a future political model that could suit economic growth for regions like Cornwall would be more of a federation model or a federal government model that you have in the United States, where actually there seems to be a lot of powers that devolve down to communities? They can decide and they're almost empowered. I think the banking one earlier was about the Bank of North Dakota, where actually they're able to make their own decisions. Do you think that's a political change that needs to happen in the UK?
I think it's absolutely critical. I'd say, I mean, it's kind of not with a NEF hat on, I suppose, but yes, I'd say it's absolutely central. Look, we live in about the most centralised, advanced country anywhere in the world. Japan's slightly more centralised than here. And that's a centralisation that's not historically what has applied in this country. It's a centralisation that this date keeps coming up, that's appeared in the last 30 years or so. But if you look at the capacity now of local councils, local authorities to really make a difference in an area, it's completely crippled compared to what it would have been a few decades ago. They have very, very limited resources, which puts everyone in a very bad place, because then you have to try and work outside of those frameworks a bit, which is why the transition towns and other such initiatives are interesting, because you have to try and get out of that. But if you want to do something about it, well, it has to be a transfer of authority out of Westminster. You know, there's a real issue of political capture here. If you saw the front page of the Financial Times yesterday, the extraordinary amounts that hedge funds, like the most gambling and unpleasant part of the financial system, now donating to one of the main political parties, not naming names. But this political capture, the capture by the media, that centralisation reinforces bad outcomes everywhere else. So you have to break it. I mean, it's one reason why I thought the Scottish referendum and the argument of Scottish independence was so important. It was precisely making that break. All right, so you're not going to get independence, but there has to be an argument for redistribution of meaningful power. You know, power that people want, that can make a difference where they live. And that, I think, if we can start pulling that out after the election, I mean, the election's going to be a mess, but it strikes me that it's going to be the kind of mess where people go, well, we can't carry on like this. An argument for kind of federalisation, devolution of powers right the way across the rest of the country, I think would be a very strong one.
Okay, that's a very articulate yes, I think. Who's the next person? I think there's a person, yourself.
Yes, my name's Cornelius Olivia. When you're talking about inequality, you're talking about more than just inequalities of income, but the absence of, or presence of good quality public services makes it. So you can be poor, but if you've got access to the National Health Service, then that makes you equal with somebody who's got a much higher income. So do you think that one way of addressing inequality is not just about inequalities of income, it's about free, high-quality public services?
Yes, there you go, that's a very short... no, it really is. It's quite hard to measure, that's the problem, right? So you start with a central measure, which is like income or wealth. Well, wealth becomes difficult to measure. And then you can say, well, actually, this decline in real wages is going to be worse if public service quality has also declined, right? So it exaggerates what's going on. So yes, I think it's essential.
Very good point. Leslie? Yeah.
We heard this morning that...
Did you say who you are?
Yes, it's Andrew Stott from Transition. We heard this morning that the high street banks are creating 90% of the credit of the country. What wasn't said, but is a fact, is that certainly in 2010, only 8% of what they lend out is going to GDP generating parts of the economy, and the rest is going to sort of property asset bubbles, which has created the asset bubble that's impoverished us all. Do you subscribe to the James Dyson positive money idea that credit creation should be the preserve of the Bank of England only, and that the bank should then auction for that credit as and when they need it, and with a caveat that it's invested towards GDP areas of the economy?
I tend to, I think positive money on that have raised a number of important points and dragged out something interesting that was otherwise not well discussed, which is what is that banks do, right? Because the idea that most people have a bank that it's somewhere you put your money into and they kind of lend it out somewhere else, that's really, really not, well, you saw the presentation this morning, this isn't how banks work. So the idea that people might have a better understanding of how banks operate is a good thing, and that's a good thing positive money have done. I don't agree with the details of Dyson's proposals in general. I think the issue here is twofold. One is that you need a degree of credit creation taking place in local areas. So you need, I would say, smaller institutions able to create credit so it matches the needs for credit. So in other words, small businesses who want a loan to expand, let's say. That is something that is best done at a local area rather than controlled and centralised through the Bank of England, I'd say. The other issue there, of course, is look, the Bank of England it's like any central bank. The central bank is there to look after other banks, right? It's only as a second point of things that it does, it kind of looks after the rest of the economy as well, because what banks do affects the rest of the economy. But this is a bank for the bankers. So it's always a difficulty if you give it more power, right? And that's one of my other problems with this thing. You can't just give the Bank of England more power. This is something that's a bank. You only take power away from banks as far as possible. So I disagree with some of the details there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next quick question. At the front, Stephen?
Yes, hello, I'm Steve from Free Living Project. Something that came up in the last few questions, and in your responses, is measurement of wealth, and how we actually, if you're always chasing GDP, it's a very blunt instrument to measure the health of an economy. So I know that NF's probably done some work on this before, so, happiness factors and that kind of thing, but how could we be influencing the situation so that they have a broader view of wealth as opposed to just, wages, income, how much you've got in the bank, and how much you're earning?
I think there's
Could you rephrase that question through at the back?
Yeah, all right. It's a question really about how do we get away from talking so much about GDP. I think it's kind of already happening. For as long as what we've seen over, again, last 30 years or thereabouts, particularly in the US, in this country maybe the last 10, 15 years or so, is that the promise of GDP is that if this number, which people sort of think they know what it is, but no one really does, so if it goes up, good things happen, like you're better off, there's less unemployment, things are okay. And that's kind of sunk into everyone's head for about 2-3 generations now. Reliable GDP figures come out in the 1940s. And it really developed as a result of the Second World War. So that's sunk in. And what's happened in the last few years is that relationship, GDP goes up, you're better off, is broken down. Now, that's a very crude way of looking at things. You're just talking about how much people are paid. But that's not a bad way to look at things. If you're concerned about inequality, if a few people are doing better and everybody else is doing worse, well, that's a big social concern. And it also starts to force open a wider argument, I think, or it could do, that GDP also misses out on a whole load of other things. If you cut down entire forests, right, and sell the wood, that's a massive increase in GDP. It doesn't count whatever other losses you may have caused there, that kind of thing. It doesn't count unpaid work. It's a massively gender-biased measure because of that. There's all sorts of problems built into it. Now, if that fundamental relationship is breaking down, we can start to talk about different ways of thinking about the economy as a result. That would be my hope out of this.
Really useful. A question here from Paul and then Alex, I think.
The chart you showed with the levels of debt, my understanding is that something like 60% of the non-financial debt is actually to ourselves, because it's owned by our pension companies. So if there is a default by the government or any of the other entities there, it is our pension that will disappear, not somebody else's money. It's where it's considered. And the second point I want to make is that we need economic growth like a hole in the head. I think what we should be aiming for is a steady state or even managed decline, because we are probably over the capacity of the planet to support the current population, and growth also to make it work.
That's two very interesting points there. It's absolutely right. Look, all of this debt has two sides. One person's a debtor, one person's a creditor. It's a liability for me, the debtor. It's an asset for the creditor, the bank, or whoever it might be. So all of this is owned by someone else. I mean, this is what gets lost in this talk about, oh, the government debt is rising. Well, the government debt is rising, and it's all being snapped up by pension funds. That means your pension funds have actually got more and more assets in them. You know, this stuff is all owned by us, some of it. Once you get into the financial part, it's all disappearing all over the world. Now, the problem you've got is that the debt is not owned on the asset side particularly evenly. This is not a nice spread right the way across the country. It's very, very heavily concentrated. And it's back to that problem, the concentration of wealth. I don't think the government's going to default anytime soon. I think that was nonsense when it was even floated as an idea back in 2010. Britain is one of only 6 countries in history not to have defaulted on its debt. Most places default, and default fairly regularly. And the big dirty secret, of course, is that usually they do better off as a result of it afterwards.
But in argument, you're saying that it's our time.
Sorry?
Yeah. Is it our time if we are the only one of 6 countries not to have defaulted?
It's, we had a sort of gentleman's agreement with America in the 1930s, which was quite close to a default, but an actual sort of technical default. It's not done that. So it's us, Japan, US, France, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Last question from Chris now. Alex, sorry, I've missed you out. Can you cope?
Oh. Sorry, I should let the chair pick.
Chris.
Chris Jones from Low Carbon Addict. Is there any fundamental reason why we couldn't have a programme of debt forgiveness across the board?
Is there any fundamental reason why you couldn't have a programme of debt forgiveness across the board? Well, no.
I don't mean ideology. I mean, is there a reason why we actually couldn't do it?
One part of it's been touched on. Right, we take government debt. Pension funds like government debt because it's very secure. So it means that it's going to sit there and it's going to pay out over a long period of time, which is what you want with a pension. So that's a problem if you start saying, let's write that off. But if you're talking about household debt, if you're talking about the debts that people owe, and if you're talking in particular about what's happened since 2008 where people have been cut off from conventional lending and forced into much more insecure forms of lending, payday loans and things like this, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't write it off. I mean, people have this sometimes a strange idea, you have to repay your debts. No, you don't. A debt is a contract between two people. The person on the other side takes a risk. That's why you pay interest on the debt, right? If they didn't think there was a risk, they wouldn't charge you any interest on it. So if they're taking the risk because you're paying interest, well, it's your lookout or their lookout if you walk away from it. Now, if you do that on a personal basis, you get in quite a lot of trouble. If you do that on a kind of managed, well, let's actually write off some of this basis, potentially you get to a better place. If your debt is really unmanageable, unpayable, Greece's debt is unpayable, and you have to write some of it off, large amount of it off, then it makes more sense to write it off and let the person carry on living their life. They need to try and insist they repay something they can't repay. Iceland is an interesting example where they have actually written off a whole chunk of mortgage holders' debt that simply become unpayable after the crisis there. You can do these things. I strongly suspect if we don't have a serious return to rising incomes and this sort of thing, it's going to start becoming a real political question in this country. We've seen a glimmer of it already with the Wonga write-off. Do you remember that a few months back, where they commissioned a load of very ropey debt that they shouldn't have sold at all, and they got forced to write it off. Now that is kind of a model for what you might start to have to do in the future.
That's an incredibly liberating thought to end on. Thank you very much.